everyone. I'm excited to be doing this. We have been in Indiana doing a Days of Our Cyber Lives podcast for several months now. Mark, you'll have to tell us later which number we're on. What we're going to do here is actually kind of do a podcast within this session. So in just a moment, Mark is going to start music and give me the high sign, and we'll kick off the podcast. We will end the podcast well before the hour is over and have time at the end for questions and answers. And certainly the questions can be about either, how do we do the podcast or why the podcast or whatever we haven't answered about that in our session. But we also have amazing cybersecurity experts on the panel. So certainly hope that you will also feel free to ask them questions. So I think with that introduction, Mark Wellner with our Indiana Bond Bank, are you ready to get us started? And just kind of give me the high sign when we should begin. Okay. Well, welcome to a live taping of Days of Our Cyber Lives. It is a podcast series brought to you by the Indiana Bond Bank and the Treasurer of State of Indiana as part of the Indiana Bond Bank Bondcast. I'm Kelly Mitchell, Treasurer of the State of Indiana and President of the National Association of State Treasurers. Woohoo! I am joined by friend, colleague, and podcast co-host Mark Wellner, the Executive Director of the Indiana Bond Bank.
Hi, President Mitchell.
You do not have to call me that.
I know, I've just always wanted to say it. It's got a nice ring to it. But anyway, just really thrilled to be taping this live episode of Days of Our Cyber Lives for the 2021 NAST TMTS. This is my first time being part of TMTS, and I am so excited. So thank you for the invite.
Oh, just very excited to have you here. But did you know that this was the big year Indiana was supposed to host TMTS in Indianapolis?
That's some unfortunate timing.
I know, but it's been amazing to see Hoosier hospitality shine through in different ways, even virtually. And today we get to continue it with 3 Hoosiers on this podcast.
Absolutely.
So, as good hosts, let's introduce and welcome our guests to the podcast.
Great idea. Let's hit it.
So, for a national audience and live taping, it was only right that we swing for the fences and invite a nationally known guest. So, I want to give a warm treasurers and podcast welcome to Ms. Teri Takai. Teri is the Executive Director of the Center for Digital Government, which is a national research and advisory institute on information technology policies and best practices in state and local government. She worked for Ford Motor Company for 30 years in global application development and information technology strategic planning. And a longtime interest in public service led her to the government sector, first as CIO of the state of Michigan, then as CIO of the state of California, and subsequently the CIO of the U.S. Department of Defense, the first woman appointed to this role. Teri has won numerous awards, including Governing Magazine's Public Official of the Year, CIO Magazine's CIO Hall of Fame, Government Technology Magazine's Top 25 Doers, Dreamers, and Drivers, the Women in Defense Excellence in Leadership Award, and the Department of Defense Medal for Distinguished Public Service. Welcome, Teri.
Well, thank you, Treasurer Mitchell. I'm so excited to be here.
Well, please call me Kelly.
Absolutely. And Kelly, I was so excited. I think you introduced me as one of 3 Hoosiers. So hopefully by the end of the podcast, I'll be official.
We'd be happy to do that, make you an honorary Hoosier.
Well, I have the honor, if I can take it from here, Treasurer Mitchell. Kelly, sorry, we want to welcome Teri. So exciting to have you on the podcast. And then introduce our second guest, who is also a trailblazer and someone I've had a chance to get to know over the years, a homegrown talent from Indiana, Mr. Tracy Barnes. Welcome, Tracy. It's good to have you on the podcast. So Tracy, as the treasurer mentioned, started as the state of Indiana's chief information officer, and he got the pleasure of starting in the midst of the global pandemic in March of 2020. So as state CIO, he has the responsibility for the management, implementation, and usability of information and computer technology across state government. As part of this role, he's part of our governor's cabinet. So he's overseeing the Indiana Office of Technology and providing that strategic oversight to our statewide technology portfolio. And before starting as CIO during that pandemic, Tracy previously served as Chief of Staff for the Lieutenant Governor, and as part of that as a Deputy Auditor and an IT Director for the Indiana Auditor of State. Welcome, Tracy. It's good to see you.
Thanks a lot, Mark. Great to be here and great to be a part of this group, and looking forward to the next hour.
Tracy, you know, I told Mark I wasn't sure we should invite you to this podcast.
Uh-oh, why is that?
Oh, it's for a really good reason. I was afraid that one of my state counterparts will realize how awesome you are and try to take you away from us.
Oh, thanks, Kelly. That's way too kind. I appreciate it. But I'm not going anywhere anytime soon.
You're in good company, Tracy, because Kelly kept uninviting me to this podcast as well.
Yeah, let's say it was for the same reason.
Ooh, Mark, you got to pay better attention.
Oh, man. Okay, well, for our first topic, let's just jump right past that. Kelly, what do you think about doing a quick reset of our vision and our mission and our why we do this joint podcast on cybersecurity? Because there's some folks out there listening, maybe new to this and wondering why a state treasurer's office and an entity that works with local units of government are even in this space.
Yeah, I love it. But let's make it interesting. Something special for a special TMTS episode.
Okay, I'm all ears. What are you thinking?
I think we flip the script on its head and we have our guests take a crack at answering that, because it'll be interesting to see their outside perspective.
Ooh, that's good. That's good, because we know why we do this. I'd love to hear, Teri or Tracy, give us a sense of why they think we should be in this space. Fantastic.
All right. Well, Tracy, if you're okay with that, I will jump in and start. I think it's really important, Kelly and Mark, and thank you so much for hosting this, because I think it's really important to look at this from two parts. One is clearly the important role that the state treasurer plays in state government. I think that any organization that is responsible for the kinds of funds that the state treasurer is responsible for, number one, of course, is a target from the standpoint of those that are looking to actually do harm to government from a cyber perspective. The second piece of it, though, is really being able to talk with local government about this. And, you know, the treasurer plays a role in two ways. One is the treasurer can certainly explain and help local government understand why attention to cybersecurity is so important. But also there's a reason for local government to be concerned, because again, state treasurer is transferring significant funds, and that increases the vulnerability in multiple ways. Number one, certainly the state treasurer's office could be vulnerable depending upon whether they have their own unique technology services support, whether they rely on someone like Tracy's organization. There needs to be an understanding of that, number one. Number two, the local government has to be concerned to make sure that they don't have vulnerabilities and they aren't going to be a part of any kind of a cyber attack. But the third piece, which is so critically important, and Tracy can speak to this, is that we're moving information, and that information, by the way, is about all of those dollars between the treasurer's office and local government. And one of the things that we're seeing more and more from a cyber perspective is that it's in that transfer of information that it introduces what we technology folks love to call a hole in both the local government and in the state treasurer's office, where a cyber adversary can actually get in and do harm. So I really applaud you for thinking of this kind of holistically and thinking about, how we can help those, both the state treasurer's office, but also local government understand how the unique relationship and exchange of information is important as we're all facing these increased cyber threats.
Yeah, absolutely. Tracy, would you add to that?
No, I think Teri hit the the nail on the head there. That information transfer piece, that's the that's the biggest concern that happens is between our state and local governments, between our federal and state governments, between our local and federal governments. The information that we are sharing with each other to try and better the lives of all of our citizens is regularly and constantly at risk. And so from my perspective, I would ask the opposite question of why not the treasurer's office and why not the bond bank, right? Is anyone that's willing to put the message and information out there to create more of that awareness, we're in favor of, and we're on board with supporting and trying to make sure we can be a part of that conversation.
Absolutely. Mark, I think we hit a home run with these guests.
I would say so. I don't know, Tracy, if there's anything you want to add from the bond bank specific side?
Well, I'll give it a shot, but I don't want everyone to think I actually understand what goes on in the mind of Mark Warner here. It's a pretty scary space. When you look at the reality that we're all serving individuals at the end of the transaction, whether it's coming from the auditor's office, the treasurer's office, the clerk's office, the secretaries of state, we need to find ways to create more education and awareness, and also raise the bar and set some elevation expectations for the reality that vulnerabilities are going to exist. And I think we've all heard the adage that it's not a matter of if it happens, but when it does happen. And that is something that we have to prepare ourselves for and make sure that we are looking forward in front of, preparing for incident response, preparing our constituents and users to be aware of the likelihood, but also doing all we can on the prevention side to make sure that it's not just that the technology is in place, but our policies and our people and our leaders are also aware of what that expectation looks like.
That is fantastic. I would add to that, we really thought of that question of why not us. We typically think of a bond bank and the treasurer maybe as financing entities. There's really that thought leadership is a strategic priority for both the treasurer and myself. And we haven't really found that, silver bullet thing that you can finance or bond for that's going to solve this. And so really, if and when we find that, we'll be happy to do it. But until then, I want to provide that information leadership in that space.
And one more quick thing, I know Teri and I talk about it all the time, is what's the main driver for all of these incidents and all of these attacks? It's the money. And your offices have money written all over them, right? Treasurer's office and bond bank. So it's a natural attraction to those bad actors.
Yeah, for sure. And as Teri pointed out, all of the state treasurers have just a wide variety of duties. But one common thread is really the responsibility of investing and safeguarding public funds, overseeing the management of the state's financial assets, and providing accurate and timely funding to state and local stakeholders. Most of us have billions with a B of assets under management at any given time. So big, broad, direct question, how should state treasurers prepare for a cyber attack in a way that would allow us to maybe sleep better at night?
Well, let me kick it off and then turn it over to Tracy. I'm not sure that there's a good answer to that. I think it's similar, as Tracy knows, because I'm sure he's been in this place. When you take your cybersecurity budget in front of your legislative committee, and they want to know, if I spend this money, will I be 100% secure? Mm-hmm. And kind of the CIO joke around that, Kelly, is that if you say yes, then the first time you have a breach, you'll be fired. If you say no, you run the risk that you'll be fired right away. So a CIO doesn't have much of a chance to actually get around that particular question. But to open it up, and before we go to the particular points that state treasurers should be thinking about, let me just follow on to a comment that Tracy made about this is all about the money. Back in the early days of cyber attacks, it was very much around being disruptive. How do I shut down websites? If all of you recall, there was what was called denial of service attacks. And all of that was very much around being disruptive. That has changed. This is very much around ransomware. how can that disruption be turned into an ability for that adversary to be able to make money? Now, a couple of facts that I think are very important. First of all, this is not about kids or individuals being at a keyboard and keying in things, if you will, that are an attack. These are software tools that reach out across all the networks, and they look for where is there a hole that they could get in. So again, this goes at the speed of the compute power that you have. It doesn't go at human speed in terms of being able to reach out and look at the vulnerabilities. The second thing that goes with that is that you don't have to be a computer genius. You can buy these tools on the dark web, and individuals are doing that. And so there's no longer kind of a concept of, well, they won't bother with me, or I'm too small for them to go after. That's really no longer the case. They're looking for any of these holes, not just because they can get to that organization, but they may be able to use that to find their way into other organizations where it may be more lucrative. So again, I'm not sure that helped with your question about sleeping soundly at night, Kelly, but I think that as we think about what things we have to do to protect ourselves, it is important to have the backdrop of, what's really going on out there.
Yeah, I appreciate that. Knowing it's automated makes it that much more scary. It really does.
That's a real good point, Treasurer, and Teri as well, is the reality that I think a lot of us are slowly starting to see, especially over these last 9 months of cyber incidents that have been going on, is there are targets that are out there. And I mean, we'd be remiss if we thought that their folks weren't looking to specifically get into certain organizations. But I think the majority of what is actually happening is much more random, is due to the automated tools that these malicious actors have put in place. They're casting a wide net. Let me just put some code out there. Let me scan every IP address I can find and look to see which one, when I knock on the door, it opens and lets me in. Because of that, we have to all accept and realize that at every level, federal, state, quasi, local county, local government, township, even to the smallest level of town like we have here in Indiana, you become vulnerable. And whether they're looking for you or they happen upon you, now you're putting the rest of us at risk. And that's the big thing that I say I would love for, folks like you in treasurer's positions in that leadership role, both internally at your states and with your local counterparts, is making sure that they accept and acknowledge and realize that they do become a incidental target that just happens to could be a direct impact on them for a ransom attack, or as Teri said, to catapult from their environment into the other organizations that they're connected to. If you think back on without getting, I try not to get too technical in some of these conversations, especially when we're talking about business people, because I try to make the point that it's just as much not an IT problem as it is a business problem, right? Is our businesses, our way of doing life, our way of operating and functioning are the things that are at risk here. And as much as we can put technology in to try and slow it down, it'll never be able to be stopped completely. And if you look at the last 3 major attacks that we've seen on the news recently, right? The Colonial Pipeline incident, the Pinellas County Water District, and even the solar winds breach that opened up some vulnerabilities at the federal level. It was money driven and random. And based on the incident that happened, the perpetrators are able to sit back and then determine what do they want to do next. And they have nothing but time on their hands to do these types of things. There are marketplaces that exist, and our real world of Amazon, there's a a marketplace of bad actors and bad code and bad tools that exist for these folks, and they collaborate and they work together, simply for the sake of having the ability to do that, and for the potential reward that comes at the end. So without being kind of all doom and gloom, that the big point I want to make sure I put out there is the realization that we're all susceptible, we're all targets, we all need to be prepared. And the more, as Teri said, you're making sure that your teams realize that this is important to you, and is important because of the funds that you are managing and overseeing, and the risk that comes with that. That helps us all in the long run.
Maybe I can ask a follow-up, because Treasurer asked a very big, hard question. Maybe stepping back, how do you even start the conversation? So let's say you're an entity the size of the Indiana Bond Banks. We've got 5 staff. None of us have any, there's no CIO, there's no IT person. But clearly, as you said, it's a business issue. It's not a technology issue. So how would it, if I was a 5-member council or local unit, how might you even start that conversation where you don't have the confidence that you know the ones and the zeros? You know, what are those first questions? What do you look at, Tracy, Teri?
Well, one of the things I think that's so important for everyone to understand is that nobody's alone in this journey. In fact, one of the things that, our folks that Tracy and I work with, we talk about the importance of collaboration, the importance of sharing information. And so I think the thing that's really important is to reach out, to talk with the state treasurer's office, to talk with some folks in state government. Tracy's got cybersecurity experts in his organization, and they can provide information about what the state's doing to reach out to other local governments. I think it needs to generate a conversation around, where is my technology? Who's running my technology? Who should be running my technology? So there are a lot of resources out there, Mark. And that's why I think it's so important to, as a business person, reaching out and not feeling like you have to solve the issue. There are many out there who are working on it. It's just making that right connection and making sure that you're being a responsible steward of your own technology.
That's a real good point, Teri. And as Teri mentioned, we have a similar organization, NASIO, which I'm sure you guys are aware of and engage and interact with. And there's not one of my counterparts that I've talked to that have said, we're not trying to work with our local governments. I mean, everyone is at the table and trying to find more ways to make that table bigger. So that we can make those conversations with those elected officials and those local county councils a lot easier, and give them some direction, right? I mean, we know from the local government standpoint, dealing with workforce issues, addiction and opioid problems and challenges we've had here in Indiana, economic development issues, technology is usually not going to be the first thing at the top of the list. But the reality that they need to start thinking about is if we're granted money from the state or from the feds, and we have to end up paying off money for ransom because of a technology breach, we're doing a disservice to those dollars and to those constituents that we're supposed to be building whatever that infrastructure, that development initiative for, that we were receiving the funds for. So how do we make sure, as Teri said, we're being better stewards of those funds for those residents across the nation, and reaching out to the counterparts and the individuals that are starting to make themselves more available to help address the problem more holistically?
Yeah, Tracy, I think we've talked about, since you're talking dollars, about this issue on another podcast, but if you could touch on it again. I'm a past county commissioner, a small rural county, and there's just no financial resources to even have, more than maybe one IT person, or, there's not the resources so many times in local government units to do a lot in the cybersecurity arena. Do you have any ideas or resources that you could put out there for our guests to look into?
So there's a couple areas that I would say we can start looking at, and folks need to be aware of, right? Homeland security has a decent number of grants that are starting to be made available, and the cybersecurity space is starting to open up as a allowed expenditure to support some of the growth and the expansion needs that are needing at the local level. Something I'll advocate for, and kind of a shameless plug here from our NASCIO group is, last congressional session at the federal level, there was some new funding that was planned and slated for purely for state and local government cybersecurity grants for the first time. Hoping it comes back on the table this year. And if so, it would be a huge step in making sure that we're getting funds to those areas that don't have the typical resources to help protect themselves, and even, like you said, to find resources. But something we're doing here in Indiana, one of the things we're doing at the state level here is we're looking at all of our current contracts with our vendors that we've vetted, we've validated, we are interacting and engaging with, and making sure that there's provisions that allow our local governments to buy off of those contracts. Giving them somewhat of a, I don't want to say a preferred vendor list, but at least a vendor list that shows that they've been through some level of validation. There's some level of comfort and confidence with our state operations, and potentially even getting them our pricing because of the large volume that we bring to the table to help make some more of these tools a lot more accessible for their needs and operations. Would love to be able to do more, and hoping to get more of that and more engaged in that over the next couple of legislative sessions here in Indiana. But definitely, there are groups and there are opportunities between state government. You look at what's happening, especially with the CARES and ARP funds on the health side of things, and how do you use a small tool like that to help address a broader problem at the local level. It's a lot of creativity that's also been out there, and a lot of the state CIOs have been getting extremely creative. So if you're not very closely connected to them, they can be a very good asset in knowing how to help get funds into some of these much needed places and areas.
Yeah, I would add some other thoughts. There are some locations around the country where cities and counties are banding together, if you will. When you're too small to really have your own technology organization or have that level of expertise. I certainly know in the county that I live with here in Michigan, the county actually offers services to the cities within the county. Because again, you're not going to be able to have that level of technical expertise in each small entity. And so I think that, that's a conversation. And to Mark's point earlier, that's a conversation that shouldn't just happen among the technology folks. That's where the business folks get together and say, should we approach the state and see whether we can use some of the services that Tracy provides for the states that might be beneficial for local government? Or if you're a department within the state that maybe is running all of your own technology, should you be thinking about, getting those technology services from a larger organization that has more knowledge and more experience around it? So the ability to really protect with each small organization, I think as Tracy said, there's lots of things that he's doing around being able to provide those technologies, but it's also around, as you think about it, how you're going to run your technology. I think this is an opportunity to think more broadly about sharing those skilled resources and servicing, having a larger organization that services more than just one organization.
Thank you. I really appreciate those thoughts. Maybe in just a couple of minutes, we could talk about what are the first 2 or 3 things we do if we find we are indeed a victim of a cyber attack. In Indiana, I'm gonna call you Tracy. That's my number one. But just in general, perhaps Tracy, if you want to start, and Teri, if you want to follow up and just talk about that.
This is an area where I think we all have an opportunity for maturity, because of there's a lot of confusion on when an incident happens is where to start. I know we've had it here in Indiana, confusion. Do I call local police? Do I call state police? Do I call FBI? Where does Homeland Security fit in? Do I call an IT guy? Do I call my insurance guy? And the answer is really kind of all of the above, right? there's the requirements that are dictated by a lot of the legislative codes across the nation. So like specifically here in Indiana, if there's an actual loss of protected data, our Attorney General should be one of the first calls that has to be made to make them aware of that loss. We also, which I hopefully we'll get to talk about here in a bit, have a new bill in Indiana where we're going to have some expectations of local governments having to let us know at the Office of Technology about an incident or breach that happens within their jurisdiction. The last difficulty that also we're trying to find some good common ground on is between, you know, state police, Homeland Security, National Guard. From an actual response standpoint, do we have people prepared to respond? Do we have people able to quickly get on site to help address an issue, an incident? Depending on the type of attack, should it be state level people, or does it make more sense for the FBI because of it potentially having a much broader impact and footprint? And it's hard to give a straight, direct answer of call here, as much as it is, you know, depending on this attacking situation, making sure that your organization has the right sequence of numbers for your organization. Businesses are being held to a very different standard right now because of some of the SEC requirements on their filing side. Governments, sounds like there's the new executive order at the federal level are talking about trying to find ways of getting more awareness and incident reporting when attacks do happen. But the question is still a matter of is it an attack that has actually impacted business or impacted protected information and data? And if so, should our first response be to try and close the hole and stop the bleed before worrying about reporting and investigation? So that's a difficult one to answer. And you know, most good continuity plans and incident response plans, as agencies and entities start to put those in place, that should be a very jurisdiction specific kind of response as to what needs to happen there to make sure that you're following the legislative legal requirements of your area.
Teri, would you add to that? Thank you, Tracy.
Yeah, I definitely would. And I'm going to be a little bit, sound a little bit trite, and I don't mean to. But the first thing is, it's great you should ask the questions now, because you should ask the questions now and get the answers before you get breached. And, you know, to Tracy's point, have a conversation. You know, Tracy's folks can help with giving you more detail on what he just laid out. So the first thing is, you know, to ensure that you have that plan in place. And I would emphasize one thing that Tracy said: be sure that you understand what your requirement is to inform anyone that is impacted by this, you know, of the fact that you've had a breach, because the state has certain requirements for that, and you need to know that. All right. The second thing is, it is very important to know, how do you shut your technology down until you figure out how badly you've been breached? Sometimes you just got to do that. As ugly as that all sounds, particularly if you need to bring in outside resources, and you need to be prepared for how you would do that. How are you going to communicate? How are you going to tell people that that is what, in fact, you've had to do? And then I think the third thing is, and this really goes back to thinking about a cyber attack like you would a natural disaster. I mean, when you do natural disaster planning, you figure out where the people are going to go. You think about where's your information that might be in filing cabinets. Well, guess what? Your filing cabinet is now in a computer, and you have to think about, what does that mean? So all of the things that you would do in a disaster recovery and planning standpoint for a natural disaster or for a physical disaster will be the same things that you'll do from a cybersecurity perspective. And that way, if you've thought through some of those things ahead of that breach hitting, then you know, it'll shorten that time. You'll know who to call, and you'll have established those relationships ahead of time. And then you can take action. Again, maybe it's not going to keep you from being up at night, Kelly, but it certainly is going to make you feel better that when something happens, you already know how you're going to respond.
Mhm.
And that's the big key right there, Teri, is how do we respond? Because it's to some extent will happen.
And that is fantastic. I think putting in the context of those physical disasters, which, you know, hopefully we've all thought about, okay, what do we do if something happens? This is just another kind of disaster, right? And so we all should have those continuity of operations plans. And so that's fantastic, Teri, to kind of put it in that mindset. Tracy, you mentioned earlier, you know, Kelly asked about resources, thinking monetarily. I think you also mentioned kind of the information as a resource too, and like knowing when things are happening is really important, and probably a patchwork situation. Treasurer, I know you and I have talked about this a little bit. I don't know if you want to elaborate that as we kind of move into the bill that Tracy was talking about.
Tracy, do you want to just talk a little bit more about that bill that just, I believe, the governor signed?
That's correct. We had it signed about 3 weeks ago, and it goes into effect July 1st of this year, and extremely excited about it. Here in Indiana, there has not been a formal connection between our state technology office and our local government technology entities. And it's I think it's just been the natural progression of how our state office has been created. I don't think it was in any way intentional or an oversight, just the natural progression of the growth that we've had here at the state and the growth of technology as a whole. But one of the things that we wanted to figure out is we've done a lot of research, and one of the things that we've seen pretty significantly is the concern that there's still only about 15 to 20% of cyber incidents that are actually getting reported, which is a very small number.
Very low number.
And so the reality is we don't truly know how big this problem is. We can anecdotally think about the massive impact that we all just witnessed with the Colonial Pipeline situation, for example. But how many more incidents have occurred or have happened over the last week? I mean, those numbers are still kind of a ghost in trying to figure that out. And so one of the steps that we've taken here in Indiana was a piece of legislation we just submitted this session and unanimously passed both chambers here of our legislature. And it now is going to require local governments to notify the Office of Technology within 48 hours of a cyber incident. Now that could be massive, and we put a lot of time and effort working with the national associations, the Association of Indiana Counties and Cities and Towns, and our Indiana Municipalities associations as well, to make sure that we had a manageable list. We didn't want to put a significant burden of effort on our local governments that are already overtaxed and overwhelmed. But we wanted to put something in place that gave us awareness early on for a couple reasons. One, the earlier we can find out about it, the faster we can share that information with other jurisdictions to be on the alert that there is a known threat of a known vulnerability that you may want to check your infrastructure and environment for, and be aware that there are people in the area, in the vicinity, right? It's that neighborly, if you see something, say something kind of adage from a world of technology. The other piece is hopefully for more of a long-term footprint is we talk about funding and where the need is at. And without knowing where the threats and problems are, we can't determine where the need is at. And if there is a potential opportunity for funding, what's the priorities? You know, where are the areas that are being impacted the most? What are the jurisdictions that are having the most difficulties or being targeted the most? With the hope and whim and chance that there may be funding in the pipeline, that we can then say, you know what, let's get down to the Northwest region or over to the Southeast region, because there's for whatever reason, a lot of attacks are happening in that area and a lot of vulnerabilities, and we as a state can't be put in a better position until we get them into a better position. So those were the main goals that we were looking for. And like I said, extremely excited that we got the level of support that we did across the legislature on both sides of the House and both parties to get that push forward as kind of step one. You know, we want to start somewhere. We want to make sure that for one, people see the State Office of Technology cares about more than just, as I say here in Indiana, the 3 buildings of downtown Indianapolis. I can't comfortably sit down with our governor and say, we're safe or we're comfortable without having a better picture and understanding of what's going on across the state. And so that's what keeps me up at night is only as safe as that weakest link, right? And I want to make life easier for our county treasurers when they're working with our state treasurer office. And so we have that connectivity, we have that integration. The same with our auditors' offices, our county auditors and our state auditor. I want to make sure that they can seamlessly move data between each other and share information as they need to. But with the potential that they have vulnerabilities or issues, how do I find ways to be aware and better protect them so that I'm better protecting myself? So very excited. Luckily, got it through this first time around. And coincidentally, state of West Virginia, if their treasurer is on, just passed very similar legislation as well. So it's starting to get some traction nationally. I think there's maybe one other state that has something similar. And again, I'm hearing the feds are looking at a broader type of approach from the private sector and business side of things, just because of the potential, the realization that we have to start sharing data. We all have to know we can't stop something if we're not aware of it.
Absolutely. And yeah, I just did see something in the headlines about the lack of a national database for this. I don't know, Teri, if you know anything about that.
Well, yeah, a couple of things. First of all, congratulations, Tracy, for getting that legislation passed. I know, it's always a struggle and it's always a challenge. So I think it's great that Indiana is kind of out there because other states, as you say, will come and look at Indiana as an example. I mean, I used to love to say there's only 50 of us. So, we're all trying to figure out what somebody else is doing to figure it out. So congratulations. And, I think back to your question, Kelly, yes, in fact, the federal government and the Organization in Homeland Security is looking at how to increase information sharing. That's a theme that you hear from the federal government, as I say, at Department of Homeland Security. You hear it from many of the cybersecurity organizations out there. But sometimes, as much as we get messages out and we can talk about the why, there needs to be something like the legislation that Tracy was just able to get passed to kind of get people kind of over that hump and understanding and giving them a reason to share that information. And then the real value of it, though, is what Tracy talked about, is that once they get over the hump, that they don't think somebody's trying to get them or somebody is trying to, make them look bad, they'll realize, I think, that it's really about, if without that collective information, that with the speed and the type of attack that we're getting, we're just not going to be able to protect the whole of state government. And that's really what this bill is about.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thank you guys so much for this wonderful time of information sharing. You've really been insightful, I know. Teri, the power invested in me as state treasurer, I'll name you honorary Hoosier.
All right.
Mark, do you have any closing thoughts?
Thank you, Teri. Thank you, Tracy. We are so excited, as always. We'll post this out to our social media, and Teri and Tracy, Treasurer Mitchell, will share this out. If you've enjoyed this, link to our podcast, subscribe, whether you're watching this on YouTube or whether you're listening to the audio through iTunes or your platform of choice. Hit subscribe for content from the Indiana Bond Bank on the Days of Our Cyber Lives podcast. We enjoy bringing you this content and information. We've got great guests who change every podcast. So it's just something fun for us to facilitate. And again, hit that subscribe button. Thank you for listening. Thank you to our guests. And Kelly, I'll let you take us home.
Yeah, I'll just say again to all of you for being here, for listening. This is Indiana State Treasurer Kelly Mitchell signing off from the 2021 Treasury Management and Training Symposium for this special episode of Days of Our Cyber Lives. All right. Thank you all for joining in. That was a real live episode of one of Indiana's Days of Our Cyber Lives podcasts. We will take that portion of the recording and put that out for our local government units. But meanwhile, we do have a few questions that have been put out. And I will say as well, Kari posted the link to the DHS announcement of the preparedness grants and to the NASIO, if I'm saying that right, organization. Well, one question here, I'll read it to you. Oftentimes we think of our cybersecurity risks related to employees being hacked, but if you are a local government that works with external vendors who have access to your platforms, are there any best practices to ensure that if they are hacked, your information is protected? Or are there certain questions we should be asking vendors to minimize that risk?
Well, let me kick it off, and then, I think that Tracy can chime in here. I think, first of all, from a preventative standpoint, it's very important that you have a strong set of policies and actions around your data backups, making sure that you always have access to data. One of the big things about ransomware is that what ransomware does is not only threaten to shut you down, but it threatens to take away access to your information. And what we find is that those organizations that have those backups, they know what data they have, that they're actually able to resist the ransomware because, they can carry on government without that. Secondly, it is important to employ technologies that actually monitor those external, quote, links to make sure that there isn't what we call unusual behavior. There are tools out there that you can buy and that look for some of that unusual behavior. And then there are definitely technology solutions and technology approaches that should be a part of what you ask your vendors about. And you should have a plan and a process where you validate and you check all of those interfaces from time to time to make sure that something hasn't changed, as it relates to how you exchange information. I think that the main thing I'd say here, I'll turn it over to Tracy, is number one, it's great to be conscious of the fact that that's a vulnerability. And second of all, to be thinking about what are the specific technologies and steps, to be sure that you're monitoring whenever those exchanges take place.
Yeah, and I'll just briefly add, it starts as well with the contract with that partner and that vendor, is making sure there's legal acknowledgement of the expectations of meeting certain levels of security standards and of the communication of incident or breach to you if they have a problem on their side. If you go back within the last 10 years, the large Target breach that happened, the hackers did not get into Target's infrastructure. They got into their HVAC infrastructure, partner infrastructure, and catapulted in to pull down the credit card data from Target. So it's a legitimate concern and a legitimate need. And so monitoring and good legal contract language to make sure that there's a strong relationship between the expectations and their requirements of staying abreast of their security protocols as an organization and as a vendor, I think are going to be testament to that.
Well, great answers. And we have several questions. I'm going to, we only have a few minutes left, so I am going to pick one that, and paraphrase it slightly. in the sense that we see and we understand how important transparency is, so that we know what's going on, we're sharing that information. But there could be a downside to that if you're sharing with government entities and it gets to the media or somewhere before you don't have all the answers, or you don't have your message ready to go. Could you talk about that for just a moment?
Yeah, briefly. We have some unique language, I think, around our public records disclosure, that we've been able to put some exceptions around cybersecurity information and cybersecurity contracts and some of those vendors. It's a big concern with, especially in the investigative process, that they're not allowed to share information and such. And so we understand, and our legislation, I think, calls that out and says that, you know, if you're in the midst of an investigation and FBI has told you not to share it, then so be it. But what we're focusing on doing is anonymizing the information that we're sharing out, right? So if County X lets us know they have a problem, our goal isn't to embarrass County X or to bring attention to County X. It's really to let folks know that this tool set, this attack vector, and this technology is in this area being targeted and being looked upon. So we're not sharing full details. It's truly more technical information to technical points of contact, to try to close off the vulnerabilities and protect themselves, without getting into the media sharing and putting it out for public consumption. So we're being very cautious about that, and very intentional on what we're sharing and with who we're sharing it with. But I think that's something that I know we worked with our cybersecurity council and our Secretary of State's office a few years back, because of the volumes of FOIA and APRA requests that entities are putting out there to try and determine, well, what technologies are you guys using? Fair and reasonable question from a transparency standpoint, but from a sharing of too much information and giving a roadmap to how to get into our systems doesn't make a lot of practical sense.
Yeah, I would add that's the importance really of the legislation that Tracy was able to put through, because when you have legislation like that, it lays out a process and it lays out ground rules, so that you're not sort of just randomly sharing information, which is, I mean, sharing information is good, but it needs to be in a structured process to be able to protect. So I just want to emphasize it. That's really one of the, you know, important points of Tracy having taken a whole of state look at it and actually put out those procedures, because then that allows for that sharing of information, but at the same time, that confidentiality.
Oh, well, much appreciated. I think we're down to the last 3 minutes. Do you have either of you, a piece of advice you'd give to a treasurer? Take away one thing from this this podcast. What would you say?
Well, I'll start. I think the piece of advice that I would have is to understand where your data are from a technology perspective and who is protecting it. And if the who is protecting it isn't a great answer, find someone that has the expertise to help.
Thank you.
Yeah, that's a great point. Guys like me, I mean, this is what we've built a lot of our jobs and our careers on, but know that the positions that you all have are much more valuable and important in fighting this new technical pandemic that we're facing here. So you have a role and you have an opportunity to have an impact. And the more you can continue elevating the concerns from a business perspective, I think it starts to fall on deaf ears when the IT guy keeps saying, hey, we need stronger security, we need more protection. But when the business individuals and the utility directors and the treasurers come forward and say, hey, I'm worried about our money or our infrastructure, it gets a different perspective across. So know that you have a voice that can be very helpful to the overall battle.
Absolutely. Thank you. Mark, what would you add?
Gosh, nothing from the cybersecurity standpoint. You don't want to hear any of my advice there. But from the means of delivery of the information, I think treasurers just know that you've got a platform. We've chosen to complement the newsletters and the email blasts and the ways that we otherwise communicate with customers, constituents, partners to do this podcast. And it just fits in really well into the grand scheme of things. And I think really the hardest thing is, getting the gumption up to hit record and put yourself out there and do the first one. After that, it's, again, just great conversations with good guests. And so I'd encourage state treasurers listening to this, local officials. It's a great way to get a message out as you continue to evolve and try to reach folks in different ways.
Absolutely. Thank you. And just all of you, thank you again, Tracy, Teri, Mark, for taking the time to do this for us. We really do appreciate it.